a first-class general staff who understood his mind and methods and could carry out his intentions religiously.
Construction complete.
This was something none of the British commanders had. Indeed, it was denied to the two outstanding generals of the next generation, Napoleon and Wellington. But in strict military terms, it was all Washington had. In all other respects, he was outnumbered, outgunned, and outfinanced. One of his opposite numbers, Sir Henry Clinton, lived on his expenses, banked all his handsome pay, and returned to England defeated but a rich man. Washington will never go down as one of the great field commanders. He was not an accomplished tactician and rarely trusted himself, or rather his men, to maneuver once battle began. Though he was always hyperactive himself, riding about and whacking with his sword both enemies and cowards among his own troops. Of the battles he fought, he lost 3 out of 10. On the other hand, he was a strategist of genius, who understood very well what kind of a war he was fighting and how to win it. Washington started with a fundamental conviction that America's cause was not merely just morally, but legitimate in a legal sense. The colonies, now states, had been self-governing since their inception and delegation of power by their peoples to legislative assemblies. Britain's assertion of power, as in the Declaratory Act, was ultra vires and a usurpation, and resistance to it not merely lawful, but a moral obligation. He never deviated from this belief, which was the ultimate source of his energy and determination to win, especially when times were bad. It followed from this that Congress was a legitimate government, as entitled to obedience and internal respect as Britain's own, that the army was its duly constituted military arm, and that he, as its commander-in-chief, was as possessed of all the rights as any field marshal of a great European power. That is why, in correspondence with British commanding generals over treatment of prisoners, he not only insisted on reciprocity. Americans held by the British were never to be treated as rebels, but as POWs, just as he respected the martial rights of his prisoners, but also that he was addressed in letters as General Washington. Otherwise, he refused to receive them, and he won his point. At all costs, Washington was determined to preserve the congressional government and the army as its instrument, and never to lapse into guerrilla status. He was convinced, rightly, that if he kept in being the American government and army long enough, the British, tired of the war, would recognize their existence, this being the prelude to negotiation, which must end in independence. He therefore fought a war of endurance and attrition, avoiding pitched battles except when circumstances were overwhelmingly in his favor, unworried by defeat so long as he kept his army together and the government, in effect, ruling the country. The British strategy was the logical opposite. Congress had no legitimacy, the army was a band of rebels, and Americans, however organized, could never be more than subjects, with no more collective rights than Indians. The king and his government, therefore, always insisted that no negotiations were possible until resistance had ceased. The generals and admirals appointed, General Gates, then General Howe and his brother Admiral Howe, General Clinton, then General Cornwallis, were never given authority to diverge from this position in the smallest particular. Granted the obstinacy and self-righteousness of George III and the immense financial and other resources of Great Britain, that meant a long war. Although in 1775 British troops were thin on the ground, by summer 1776, the largest expeditionary force in British history, perhaps the largest ever dispatched from Europe until Napoleonic times, with 32,000 fully equipped men, was landed in the New York area. This deployment was constantly reinforced and was backed by half the world's largest and most efficient navy. George III could draw not only on his own troops, but on mercenaries from Germany, and over 30,000 of them, mainly Hessians, were sent across the Atlantic. With complete command of the sea until 1781, the British could land, embark, and land again their troops and artillery anywhere along the American seaboard, having safe fleet bases in Nova Scotia to the north and the West Indies and Bermuda to the south. In this sense, they could dictate the strategy. On the other hand, other than George III's obstinate resolve, they had no emotional commitment to the war. At the time of the first troubles in Massachusetts, 1773 to 74, there was some popular enthusiasm in England for the rebels to be punished, but that soon disappeared, and thereafter the British public was indifferent. The war made virtually no impact on the letters, literature, and even newspapers of the time. The British were going through a revolution, not only in agriculture and industry, but in transport, as the national system of canals and turnpikes was built. Money was being made in unprecedented quantities by most classes. British trade was expanding all over the world. At home, villages were expanding into towns, and their inhabitants changing their occupations, joining the wage economy. The people had other things on their minds. The Crown was never short of a servile parliamentary majority of placemen and pocket borough MPs to vote for the war, and economic expansion made it comparatively easy to pay for it. But few had any idea what was going on across the Atlantic, and fewer still cared. It might have been different if George III and his ministers had been able to organize an effective loyalist party in America. Washington calculated that only 1/3 of the people, chiefly in Massachusetts and Virginia, actually supported the war, and that 1/3 were loyalists. The rest were uncommitted. But by his own definition, George III could never treat the loyalists as allies. They too were merely subjects. So there was no attempt to organize them, and no leaders appeared. The loyalists never posed a military threat to Washington, or a political threat to Congress. All leaders of opinion were on the revolutionary side. In Britain, it was the reverse. All the politicians of substance, the opinion formers, the ministers, and such churchmen as carried weight thought the king mistaken and wanted a negotiated settlement. Washington was aware of these sentiments and knew that if he could hang on long enough, all support in Britain for the war would disappear. He also calculated, rightly, that the longer the inconclusive war continued, the more likely it was Britain's European enemies, French, Spanish, Dutch, whom she had robbed of their colonies, would join in against her. And indeed, from the first years of the fighting, Benjamin Franklin was able to set about organizing arms supplies from France. A central element of Washington's strategy and a source of his confidence is that time was on his side. Nevertheless, the burdens he carried were almost beyond even his energy and resourcefulness. The British initially believed their early victory was inevitable, because militiamen and civilian soldiers could not stand up against regular troops. They were proved wrong, yet Washington himself partly shared this belief. As he put it to one of his principal correspondents in Congress, John Hancock, September 24, 1776, "To place any dependence upon militia is assuredly resting upon a broken staff. Men just dragged from the tender scenes of domestic life, unaccustomed to the din of arms, totally unacquainted with any kind of military skill, which being followed by a want of confidence in themselves when opposed to troops regularly trained, disciplined, and appointed, superior in knowledge and superior in arms, makes them timid and ready to fly from their own shadows." He found this true time and again, and it was essential in his eyes for the bulk of his army to be on regular engagement. The difficulty was that under the Articles of Association, 1775 to 76, precursor of the U.S. Constitution, Congress could not raise taxes to pay a national army. It could merely negotiate levies from individual states. Much of Washington's time, and 2/3 of his vast wartime correspondence, was devoted to begging money and supplies from his political superiors. In this unremitting effort, he was, happily, as obstinate as George III in continuing the war. Even so, as he wrote to Nathaniel Greene after it was all over in 1783, "It will not be believed that such a force as Great Britain has employed for 8 years in this country could be baffled in their plan of subjugating it by numbers infinitely less, composed of men oftentimes half-starved, always in rags, without pay, and experienced every species of distress which human nature is capable of undergoing." It was precisely 400 men in a night crossing of the Delaware River, which was choked with ice floes, and the next day defeated the Hessian garrison at Trenton, taking 900 prisoners. A week later, he personally led an attack at Princeton, breaking up the British force. These two minor victories did wonders for American morale, both in the Army and in Congress. Describing the Revolutionary War is difficult because it had little discernible pattern. The British had the initiative almost throughout because of their larger forces and overwhelming naval arm. But with frequent changes of command, their strategy lacked consistency. General Burgoyne was sent south from Canada in 1777 to seize the Hudson Valley and cut off New England, the seat of the rebellion in their eyes, from the rest of the colonies. General Howe should have moved up the Hudson to meet Burgoyne. Instead, he moved south to Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. He defeated Washington at Brandywine Creek in September and Germantown in October. But in the meantime, Burgoyne had been forced to surrender at Saratoga to a force under General Horatio Gates. That, in turn, led to a crisis in the American camp, for some officers, contrasting Washington's failures with Gates's successes, conspired to make him the commander-in-chief. The plot, called the Conway Cabal after General Thomas Conway, a disgruntled Irish volunteer, was easily frustrated by Washington's magnanimity, based on his knowledge that the entire rank and file supported him. The winter of 1777 to 78 was seen, at the time, as the nadir of American fortunes. In fact, Washington's strategy of attrition was beginning to work. On February 6, 1778, France recognized American independence and signed a treaty of alliance, pledging